My pleasure to turn the program over to Tina, our National Watershed Coalition Chair, for some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Welcome to the first NWC webinar of 2025, and we are so glad you're here. I'm Tina Hendon, Chair of the National Watershed Coalition, and before we get started with the program, I wanted to share a little bit about the National Watershed Coalition, and then I'll turn it over to our Executive Director, Jean Sawburn, to introduce her today's topics. There we go. All right. First, we've got a great leadership team in place now, including, in addition to myself, we've got Tom Good from Oklahoma. He's the vice chair. Lisa Knopf Owen, who's the past chair, also from Oklahoma. Barb Olchen is the secretary treasurer. She is from Kansas. Jean Sawburn, the executive director, is from West Virginia. And Dr. Dan Sievert is our senior policy advisor, also from Oklahoma. So a little bit about what we do. We were first formed about 36 years ago, and our membership is made up of national, regional, state, local organizations, associations, and individuals. So our mission is to strive to secure funding for the PO 534 and 566 Small Watershed Program. We also foster communication among members and disseminate information to further efforts and benefits of the program. So the National Watershed Coalition provides expertise and consultation to our members, watershed project sponsors, and partner organizations such as the National Association of State Conservation Agencies, USDA, NRCS staff, etc. One of our most frequent requesters for information is the U.S. Congress. The National Watershed Coalition also partners directly with USDA NRCS through a cooperative contribution agreement, and that includes a number of activities that benefit USDA NRCS and the watershed sponsors across the country. Included in that is producing educational materials, webinars, and on-site trainings. Some of the resources that you can access through our website and through our Facebook page, which is constantly updated with new information, include legislative materials, fact sheets, and videos on a host of topics, success stories from across the nation and U.S. territories. And our website now allows for membership payment. So these are the ways you can contact us, interact and let us know what you like, what you want to see or hear more of. Let us know about your success stories, and like us on Facebook to get those alerts and news directly to your feed. And thank you again for joining us today. Now I'll turn it over to Jean.
Thanks so much, Tina.
Not clicking. There we go. So good day, everyone. Today we have a very interesting webinar considering the amount of rainfall, at least on the East Coast, that we've been getting. It's not one to advance, right? So, yep, there we go. So today's topics: watershed program opportunities for flood-prone communities. So today we hope to learn, we will learn about the program assistance provided under the EWP program with project sponsors for flooding and erosion protection following a natural disaster, including structural solutions that protect communities from additional flooding threats, and financial assistance for sponsor-led property buyouts. And I think we're going to hear a lot about the buyouts today. The webinar will also include NRCS watershed protection and flood prevention operations, program assistance to sponsors in preparing and carrying out watershed plans for purposes such as watershed protection, flood prevention, assessing the extent of watershed problems and the needs of a flood-prone community, and watershed plans. They may include non-structural or structural measures.
Well, what a pleasure. Thanks, Gene, so much for outlining our purpose for the webinar today. Let me encourage you to grab a pen and paper, something to write with anyway, and use your questions and answer system on your dashboard. We'll not be using the chat today. We'll not be using the hand raise feature today, but we will be using that questions and answer system. So you can write your questions in the Q&A area in the Zoom dashboard, and questions after the webinar, you might want to write down that contact and the watershedcoalition.org. All right. It's our pleasure then. Gene, let me turn it back to you for introduction of our speakers.
Yep. All right. Today we're going to have speakers from NRCS. So let's welcome John Derbish. He's the National EWP Program Manager. And Sonia Keith. She is the Watershed Operations Program Coordinator. I think John is going to present first to us. So welcome, John.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for the intro and appreciate all the effort that the coalition does to advance and educate on our particular programs. All right, as mentioned, we're going to go through the two watershed programs that can kind of directly work with local communities and project sponsors in order to address flooding issues, being the emergency watershed program and the watershed flood prevention and operations programs as well. So as mentioned, I'm going to kick off with EWP. So what is EWP, right? So EWP, it's a very simple statute. It provides, authorizes the Secretary of Agriculture to provide flooding and erosion prevention when a natural occurrence has impaired a watershed. So what does that mean practically? You know, the program can be triggered by a federal emergency declaration. You think of your standard FEMA declaration. Hey, you know, unfortunately, large system hit here, and now we got quite a bit of flooding, enough to get the attention of FEMA. But also, it's a very flexible, EWP is actually a really flexible program because we can also deal with local watershed emergencies. And this would be the smaller things that necessarily don't trigger a FEMA response, but are definitely watershed impairments, you know, at whatever the scale is. You think about your rural communities, you think about some of the smaller areas that get impacted and need help with flooding and erosion threats. The EWP program is available for those purposes. So what's the overall look like? Hey, there's a lot of NRCS and local coordination, right? Because we work through a sponsorship method, meaning, hey, we need local sponsors to be the advocates for the community, identify the needs and do the work. And so, you know, 99% of EWP work is done through cooperative agreements. So that local NRCS coordination is paramount. So what is it? What do we do when we start getting together and talking about potential EWP projects? We're going to identify the EWP opportunities. We're going to look for flood protection measures and also stopping additional erosion. And this presentation will be a little bit more geared towards the flood protection aspect of the program, but they're both count, you know, a lot of times they run hand in hand. And so what does that actually look like at the end, right? So we're going to install EWP measures. And what is an EWP measure? It's a series of practices. Maybe think of our standard conservation practice list, but these are practices and activities that are going to remove the threats, right? Hey, this community, the flooding is a problem in this community. We are going to reduce that threat with these practices. We're going to install practices that do that. And also, being the Natural Resources Conservation Service, restoring the natural environment is an important aspect for program administration. And like I mentioned, alluded to, you know, the vast majority of our work goes through conservation practices, recognizable things. Clearing and snagging, debris removal, obstruction removal, and then the whole litany of bank stabilizations and grade stabilization structures and water management structures. So if it has anything to do with flooding and erosion and there is a threat on the ground, then EWP is a program that NRCS can provide assistance for. So getting into the workflow, what does that actually look like for a community? So a natural disaster, unfortunately, creates a flooding and erosion threats, right? So we're not first responders per se. We're not dealing with the actual situations of the immediate floods after a major event. No, we're saying more, hey, once the water subsides, hey, now we have an opportunity to, do we have erosion and flooding threats that need to be addressed? So and if the natural disaster did cause that, then yeah. So now that's kind of the first point that people can start thinking about EWP. Then we have what's called a sponsor formal request for assistance. Each EWP, you'll be able to find this in our sponsor resources, and I'll have a link to this at the end on our webpage. And it's a 2-page template, and it's the sponsor formally requesting assistance from the NRCS State Conservationist. And the NRCS State Conservationist is basically the lead line officer for an administrative unit, which is for NRCS at the state size. So that individual runs all programs in that particular state for NRCS. And so a sponsor can formally request assistance from them. So this is going to say things like, hey, we got hit, unfortunately, by a major event. Here are our threats. Here are our areas. We've exhausted all resources. This is a nasty strain on our resources, and both financially and naturally. So we would appreciate consideration for the EWP program. What that does is it kicks off. It really kicks off the program review, because now the state conservationist, which is STC on that block there, the state conservationist immediately reviews and looks for EWP eligibility. Hey, we have a disaster. Hey, we have threats. Hey, this is something that we can work on. And then if it is an eligible EWP event, they complete what's called a damage survey report. And the damage survey report is really just the proposed practices and the cost estimates. Hey, we're looking at debris removal over 1,000 feet of stream reach here, and we anticipate it's going to cost X amount of dollars a foot. And so what that does is that comes into the national program manager, and which is the seat I'm currently sitting in. And then we review it for programmatic compliance, aligned with the statute, aligned with the authority under the program. Just kind of do a cursory check on it. And then if available funds are, if funds are available, if we're not on a wait list, then we allocate those out pretty promptly to the state conservationists to go forth and do great things. So they've told us what they need. We provide the financial resources for it, and then now it's in the state conservationist hands to carry through to project completion. So back to the EWP sponsors, that formal request for assistance, and the person or the group responsible for the long-term partnership is what we'll call the sponsor. And this is, like I said, where we'll provide both technical and financial assistance to the sponsor in order to carry out these activities. Eligible sponsors for the EWP program can be a state, political subdivision of the state, qualified Indian, tribal organization, or your local unit of government, right? Think your cities, townships, counties, and the like, water management districts. But basically, the requirement is that the sponsor must have a legal interest in or responsibility for the area threatened. So what we don't do is like, oh, neighboring county is a sponsor for a neighboring county. Like, no, it needs to be the actual unit carrying it out. And not because what we would do in those situations for things that cross county boundaries, we would just go into agreements with both of those and just have two sponsors for a particular project or series of projects. So what is the sponsor ultimately responsible for? Hey, if there's a project cost share determined by NRCS, So that cost share, it can range between 25% standard, 10% for limited resource areas, and that has a specific definition and a kind of a criteria for that. But then, hey, you do have to come up with this 25 or 10% cost share, but that can be done through cash. It can be done through in-kind, different types of construction in-kind services. But really, you have flexibility working with your local NRCS state conservationists and their staff on coming up with a breakdown on how to put that together. Sponsors are also responsible for the actual real property rights for structural solutions, the water rights that are necessary, any regulatory permits. This is kind of pretty standard for NRCS activities. Just, hey, we need you to be the stewards of this particular site. Provide for required O&M. So some things might require, if it's debris removal, the state con of NRCS might say, this is done once it's done, no O&M required. Or they might be like, oh, there was some bank stabilization work, we're going to require O&M for a number of years, and the sponsor and the NRCS will go into an agreement for that long-term O&M. And also, they have to document that they have insufficient resources to provide adequate relief. So this is just a, hey, they do in fact can't afford to do this, the communities or sponsors at hand. And we're not, if there's another program that's already working with you or already dealing or already allocated funds for your project, then it would, it would be better to go with that particular element. And we're not going to we're not going to go both projects in for the exact same activity, right? So if you already got money for a bank stabilization or a property buyout or something along the lines, then we would keep those separate, those two programs separate. So EWP in context, right? So what is this? We've gotten, we have a disaster. We have a request for assistance. We've kind of started a DSR, which is kind of the kickoff of the planning process. But I always like to think of things in their respective phase or element of it. The planning, hey, we got a project. Okay, we need to plan the project, then we need to design the project, then we need to construct or do property acquisition. So for planning purposes, all, standard federal planning procedures, NRCS has a 9-step planning process, similar to many other federal agencies in their iteration. Some have a 5-step process, some have a 6-step process. We have a 9, so we win. But that starts off with the damage survey report. We do what's called an environmental evaluation. It's kind of the inventory and and starting of the assessment phase with EWP. But EWP has access to a number of categorical exemptions, and as well as we have a programmatic EIS. So our umbrella NEPA coverage is there, either through an existing 99% of the time, either through the CADXs or the programmatic EIS. We just, as long as the activities fall within the scopes of those, then NEPA coverage is done. We'll still do things like Section 106 consultation, ESA consultations as well, and any other federal responsibilities. We will always deal with that. Some states have expedited procedures, and we try to utilize those as much as we can. All right, so the next phase, hey, we got a plan. Here's our plan. All right, great. So now we need to design it. All practices basically have to go and be consistent with the NRCS National Engineering Manual. And then as well as if they look and smell like NRCS conservation practices, then, NRCS has conservation practice standards and specs that the practices will need to be constructed to, just so that we ensure that, hey, we're getting, an NRCS quality product out of this. And then lastly, okay, now we've got the design. Now we're going to do acquisition and construction. And the reason construction, structural, acquisition, buyouts, right? So Now we need to just go ahead and provide the emergency watershed protection. Let's do it. How is all of this done? How do we accomplish these 3 steps, right? And it's done, like I said, about 98, 99% of the time. My numbers might actually keep gaining, but it's through the cooperative agreement with the sponsor, right? So that's an NRCS cooperative agreement is an obligating document, which means we are binding up our money into this agreement, and the details on the responsibilities of each party will be spelled out in the agreement. So NRCS, you shall do XYZ. Sponsor, you shall do ABC. NRCS will provide $1, $2, $3 for sponsors ABC activities, right? They're very long, they're legalese in them, but they get the job done because it clearly lays out who's responsible for what and what NRCS will reimburse the sponsor for carrying out these specific, the planning, the design, and the construction activities. Yeah, and so everything's based on and spelled out in that agreement, right? Because if you look at this chart, the planning, design, and acquisition and construction, sometimes, depending on either the workload of the state, the familiarity with projects, you could staffing availability, just pick it. Design may or may not be done, may be done in-house by NRCS, or if NRCS, hey, sponsor, we would prefer you to do it, and the sponsor raises their hand, said, yes, we'll be able to acquire the designs for that, then the sponsor would do it. And then same thing with planning, and then to some degree construction, right? Hey, normally we go through the agreement, NRCS provides the funds for the sponsor to carry out the construction, and the sponsor either uses their own forces or they go and use their acquisition procedures and contract out construction. We do have federal contracts as an option for construction and likewise for design. They're just a little bit more infrequently used, but hey, if a community really is not able to go through their acquisition processes, then they can ask NRCS, hey, we need assistance with this. We think going through a federal contract might be the best option to actually get this work done, right? Because for a litany of reasons that could come up. So federal construction contracts are something that's on the table as well for EWP. So just now, what does this actually look like? The items on the ground, and these are all the time, every time conditions for the EWP program, kind of in our program's regulation. And so what are we looking for? We're looking for a practice. And so if in your mind, you can visualize a flood prone property buyout, if you're imagining bank stabilization, if you're imagining water control structures upstream, whatever it needs to do to either remove the thread or keep the water out, no matter what, all the time, every time, for anything that EWP funds, is that it has to provide protection from additional flooding or erosion. It's something that you look at and you're like, yeah, that's going to keep flooding. Or something you look at and you say, yeah, look at that scallop, it's going to keep eroding. So that's in the statute, and that's kind of an all the time, every time element of it. All right, and then reduce the threats to life or property, right? It's meant to remove the program's intent, remove the threat, and so all of our practices have to align with that. Restore the hydrologic capacity to the natural environment to the maximum extent practicable. Hey, we're just not going to build monoliths. Hey, we're just not going to just cause problems. Like, hey, no, let's remember to keep it in line with the natural environment as much as we can, and then be economically and environmentally defensible and technically sound. So this is, hey, we're not, we do have our ESA requirements, Endangered Species Act. We're going to go through our planning process to make sure that, hey, this is a good solution on the ground that's not, for lack of a better term, making a mess of the place. And then economically as well, like, hey, no, we're not going to cut off to protect one road or protect one community. We're not going to cut another one off from access. So we just need to, in the not have resulting business excessive business losses and the like. So it just has to be defensible, and we have a criteria that we go through for all of our projects. And then technically sound is just that. That's why we use the engineering manual. That's why we use the conservation practice standards. It's so that we can have something that we know that we have prepared for, and something that we've done before, seen before, and put together in the best way that we can. And then fine print. So I threw this in there. Sometimes the projects just don't work, right? And so, because if you go back to the statute, it's that the Secretary of Ag can install emergency measures. So this all goes back to, and when I say Secretary of Ag, this is what the law says, and then it's delegated down to the NRCS chief and so forth and down our line. But the point is that it's up to and delegated to the NRCS. It's NRCS's line officers call, hey, this is a eligible project or not. Like, sometimes the project just kind of veers too far away from one of these criteria that we just have to say, hey, unfortunately, this is a good project. It's just not an EWP project. We will try to help you find other programs. We will try to tailor the scope of this project so that it meets these intents. Just know that it's like the program is in the hands of USDA and NRCS. And then NRCS won't provide funding for activities undertaken by the sponsor prior to the signing of the agreement. And so this is just so, hey, we got to make sure we hit our planning. We got to make sure we hit all of our federal responsibilities. Hey, we got to make sure that it's designed correctly. So that in there is just, hey, no, wait till we will get that agreement. If the sponsor and community is ready to get to that agreement as fast as possible, we'll work with you as fast as possible to get that signed and get that signed, so that then we can go ahead and go forth and do great things. Common EWP measures, like I said, if you think stream bank and shoreline protection, critical area planting, clearing and snagging, and obstruction removal, those two combine, and we just call that debris removal. Mulching, grade stabilization structures, federally held floodplain easements. That's something we won't necessarily address in this presentation, because it's mostly handled by another division, but it's basically what it says. It's like, hey, when it makes sense for the federal government to hold a conservation easement or a floodplain easement across a big swath of land in a particular area, and it reduces the threats and it restores the environment, then that's something that the EWP program is willing to and able to take care of. And then locally led property acquisitions, right? For all intents and purposes, a buyout, right? Hey, structural solutions, and you can imagine a structural solution being way too intense, way too expensive, not necessarily feasible. But if it's a better option to just remove the properties being threatened, then that's something that the EWP program is able to do. So I like to think of this in an idealized world. NRCS staff and the local sponsors are working together with all of these options in front of them and being like, hey, listen, we can go a structural solution here, we can go a buyout solution here, we can even go an easement solution here, or we can combine all three, and we can and mix and match to find the best solution for that community to, like I said, prevent the threats from additional flooding that may occur. All right, fund uses in the cooperative agreement, like I said, just running back what I said about we get the request, we do the DSR, we allocate funds for it. And then NRCS makes financial assistance funds for acquisition, construction, and mitigation costs. We provide TA assistance for planning, design, contract administration. And some of that FA and some of that TA will get pulled into a formal agreement. And that's what sits, like I said, who does what formally. and it will document based on the sponsor's contribution to planning, design, and construction will determine what kind of financial and technical assistance dollars would be locked up into that agreement. EWP buyouts. So real quick, EWP buyouts have been around for a couple decades now. They just kind of recently been re-emphasized. But like I said, when it would be the most cost-effective and environmentally preferable solution, hey, let's rock and roll. There's still a cost-sharing requirement, 75%. Is provided by NRCS, or up to 90% for limited resource areas, and sponsors would be required to work with the landowners to purchase the fee title land and deed restrict the property. So this is basically, I like to say, if a project sponsor, if a community, if a local government knows how to acquire the land for a library, they know how to do an EWP buyout in the simplest sense. Of course, it's going to be a little bit more complicated than that. And then ultimately deed restrict the property to say, hey, it's going to continue to be open space. As I said, 3 solutions, 3 potential paths, but let's combine them. Let's figure out the best way to provide a good quality EWP project. And so at that point, I was going to ask Ray any questions, because after this, I will be going into more explanation and a little bit deeper on the EWP buyouts.
Thanks, John. Yes, we had some questions come in regarding what you've spoken about. One of them is sponsorship. Can EWP do work at a condo or a homeowners association owned properties? So a little bit about who can sponsor again. Kind of repeat that.
Yeah, so the land use itself is independent, right? Residential land, agricultural land, commercial land, heck, even conservation land, other types of conservation land. Like, the land use doesn't matter where the project actually sits. However, project sponsorship will always be some form of a state, local, or tribal government, right? Because they need to have the ability to carry out the O&M, and they need to be able to persist in long term. So yeah, the work can be carried out almost anywhere. However, the project sponsorship still needs buy-in from the community, and we ensure buy-in from the community by going through local governments.
Okay. Could have to be from that condo or that group, an agreement with that eligible sponsor, right?
Yeah. So however, whatever they work out on the side or between each other, or that's for them to sort out. With NRCS, EWP will always just be dealing with the sponsor, and then how the sponsor deals with it is how the sponsor deals with it.
Excellent. I have an overall question, John, and you may cover this a little bit later, but how long does it take from the date of request for an EWP activity to the start of the repair rehab? And wow, that's an open-ended question, because there's a wide range, isn't there?
Yeah, so we have exigency projects which can actually move really, really fast, right? So on the books, in our own agency regulations, we've said, hey, from the formal request for assistance to the damage survey report completion, NRCS has 60 days to complete the cost estimate and proposed practices, and then it would need to go into an agreement. So typically we are looking at months process for standard EWP projects. Like I said, though, alluded to, we do have exigencies where, hey, this is critical right here, and something needs to be done about it kind of yesterday. In those cases, the state and the local NRCS staff contact the national EWP team. We expedite funds. We do an abbreviated DSR. We just do everything we can, and then once the funding is allocated, then we have an expedited process with our grants and agreements division, which are the people that actually do the paperwork in order to prepare the agreement for NRCS to sign and prepare the agreement for the sponsor to sign. And they have a well-oiled process there as well. So we do have the ability to act within weeks. But standard EWP processes, we're looking at a few to several month time frame.
Okay. Thanks, John. You mentioned, I think, a couple of times who would acquire the property in an acquisition. And I understand if you want to go into that in a little more detail in your next slides, or do you want to kind of cover that now? Who would
No, just
acquire the
real quick,
property?
it's always the sponsor, right? So if the
Hmm.
sponsor says we are the local government for this particular area, we are willing, and they want to go the buyout route, then ultimately they will be the deed holders for that particular parcel.
Yeah.
And so they will carry out the deed acquisition element of it, the work of working with the landowners, acquiring the parcel and deed restricting it. So yeah, it has been, and it should be, um, the actual project sponsor, the actual unit of government, who is the one who will ultimately have the deed to that particular property.
Excellent. Has to have that authority too, right? To be able to
Yeah.
do that. That short list that you gave us a few slides back tells you who has examples of who has that authority.
Mhm.
Okay. Can EWP assist with landslide prevention in addition to the flood prevention protection?
So landslide prevention, that one's a little bit, we'd have to maybe unpack that a little bit, because again, there would need to be a qualifying event. There would need to then be a watershed impairment. And then if a erosion prevention measure makes sense, if that in the landslide, we can call an erosion feature. So if it makes sense, so I it kind of depends on some of the parameters of it, but landslides have been something that EWP has addressed in the past.
Okay. Okay. All right, very good. So this one a little bit interesting. If you have a stretch of stream, John, that is eroding badly and will affect several bridges, for example, into the future, how does how much does the Army Corps of Engineers become involved in that in-stream work?
Yeah, I don't know exactly, right? Because it's going to be dependent on, do they have a federal project there? Do they have a program that can address it? Do they have jurisdiction over certain elements? So that would just be something that would be case by case and just worked out directly with the Army Corps.
Case by case. Okay, thank you. Let's stay with practices just for a bit. Preventative measures such as planting and no-mow area, uh, top of the cliffs, along streams, that sort of thing. Speak to some examples that you have there, maybe. Of
Yeah, we have critical area planting, so it's normally it comes a lot after bank stabilizations. Um, let's say if a bank is eroding and threatening a particular road, then once we find the structural solution to kind of preventing the bank from washing away the rest of the road, any areas that's been disturbed gets critically planted, or goes through planting to make sure that any kind of the site gets stabilized, is more or less the gist of that.
okay. Let's take one more, maybe a couple more, John, if you've got time. Do you have time for
No, yeah,
more?
I'm here for you
Good.
all day.
A question about NRCS using a definition of property that requires a man-made structure. Can you speak to that? Permanently attached.
Yeah, so we have a policy statement that defines property as more or less property improvements.
Hmm.
Um, so there is the caveat that those are the types of property that are being, it's lives and property, and so lives is pretty self-explanatory, and then property has been further refined and defined as land improvements. So that's been the definition for a I'm trying to think when the regulation was last changed, for a number of years, decades is what I want to say. So yeah, in the sense of once, because if that parameter wasn't there, we would fall, to be honest with you, we would probably fall out of economic defensibility pretty fast. And then we would fall out of program shopping, because some other programs deal with kind of unimproved or agricultural lands. So the agency has kind of split out to be like, hey, there's certain USDA programs and that deal with cropland, and there's certain programs that don't. So through those series of decisions that have been made, we've landed on this definition of property means improvements on the land.
Okay. What about the railroad bridges that need stream restoration under it? Will the EWP do this also, or is it all based on the railroad having to do it, the railroad company?
So that one will fall, again, there's going to be no clear answer on that, because I know we know nothing about the responsibilities and availability of other funds for that. So if and when I hear restoration, I'm assuming mostly I'm hearing debris smacking into the railroad bridge and basically someone coming and pulling that out. All right. So if what I don't know, and what NRCS doesn't know kind of broadly, is there another avenue that also has the ability to do that? And that goes back to where I said the sponsor has to document that they have exhausted all resources. That means, hey, we're not, if there's some other program that says, hey, if there's some other, I don't know, like if they had an O&M responsibility and they had to do fund commitments to it. So we just don't know. So we will work in those situations. NRCS is able to go out there, look at it, and then do a little digging with the sponsor to be like, hey, is this in fact something that absolutely no one else can do? Then we might be able to consider it for EWP.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Going to go one more question because we worked it pretty hard here, and we'll get back to the presentation. This one deals with NRCS's definition of hydraulic capacity. What type of work would come under the arena of hydraulic capacity in terms of EWP?
So that one's quite a bit flexible. So I would, and not being an engineer, or a practice designer, I wouldn't be able to answer that necessarily directly, but just to say that from my kind of ecologist standpoint, is like, it when you see it, in that, just we need to not be doing things that are just channelizing streams. We need to be doing things that are not just hardening structures just to harden structures. So that's kind of what we come to. But like I said, we'll work that out. If a sponsor comes in and we're going down the road of EWP, once it gets to that design element, it'll all have to adhere to the EWP practice standards. So I'm sorry, the NRCS Conservation Practice Standards and National Engineering Manual, and that's where kind of those kinks will get worked out.
Excellent, John. Thanks so much. Let's go back to the presentation. And I know you've got another question and answer period coming up. So thank you.
All right. Just a little bit more on buyouts then. All right. So NRCS provides financial assistance to local project sponsors for the purchase or relocation of an existing structure in the underlying land from a voluntary property owner when the property is threatened by additional flooding or erosion, right? So the way you can think about this is, hey, we got hit with a flood at some point. Hey, this land looks like it will flood again. Hey, structural solutions are way too expensive here. Let's just try this buyout route and see if we can accomplish the protection of lives without a structural solution. So yeah, existing structures they're either demolished or they can be physically relocated to an area outside of their flooding and erosion threat, if that's a preferred alternative. All buyouts have to have long-term land protection, and what we use is a deed restriction. that it's something that it gets attached to the deed and runs with perpetuity of the land, or as long as state law allow. There's some states that only allow deed restrictions to run 99 years, but they have to be either open space and or they can have the conservation practices installed that restore the natural environment and provide from flooding and erosion protection, right? So if an area gets bought out, the options are just clean it up and put some plantings down and say good job, or hey, no, we wanted to buy out several tracts, and also we want to install conservation practices that not only that now protect others, that's available as well. So the process is, like I said, the sponsor acquires the threatened property with NRCS financial assistance. The sponsor records the deed restriction, and then voila, the land is long-term protected. Eligibility, we're looking for voluntary sellers, deed restriction that's actually approved by NRCS before it's recorded, relocated structures are taken out of the threat area, all the same general, and EWP criteria remains. There's got to be a watershed emergency. You have to be able to identify the watershed impairment, which is, hey, it's area floods. There is an imminent threat. Hey, there are people in the way here, and using the property definition that we talked about earlier in the Q&A. And all normal measure eligibility and project limitations apply. Cost effectiveness, it's okay to use the FEMA, and this is where we go into economic defensibility. It's okay to use the FEMA pre-calculated benefits of $323K per acquired property. This slide was actually a little bit outdated, but or we can develop kind of a benefits cost analysis individually as well. All right, so same deal. And so now this is quiz time. Everyone close your eyes and tell me what the buyout process is. And it looks exactly like the EWP the rest of the EWP process. So if you're a community out there that's flood prone, first step is to formally request assistance. That'll prompt NRCS to say, hey, yes, we have an eligible activity here or not. We're going to go ahead and complete a damage survey report. NRCS will internally allocate funds to the project, say, hey, we're going to take from the national pot and put it over here and barrier it off so it's available for your project. Then the state con and the sponsor get into the cooperative agreement, and then we go forth and do great things by helping people help the land. Milestones that might be present in the cooperative agreement, if you just kind of think, and this is real cursory and it's different every single time, but you think about big ticket milestones if you're going through the buyout process. Hey, we need the sponsor to circle on a map, circle the neighborhood, circle the streets, circle the two houses even, and identify the properties and identify the property owners. Through the cooperative agreement, we're able to reimburse the sponsor for the appraisals, for the title searches, for the environmental due diligence. Get NRCS concurrence on the deed restriction that will be recorded. Go forth and NRCS can either provide in advance or you can be reimbursed. Acquire the property, deed restrict the property, and then get NRCS concurrence on the design, the demolition and construction plans. And of course, this would probably happen pretty earlier in the thing. We need an O&M plan, a quality assurance plan, just standard federal construction type activities, and then solicit bids, award construction contracts, do the actual demolition and restoration, complete the closeout activities, and pat ourselves on the back that we were able to do some good work, because these projects, these have been some really useful projects. I won't get into it here, but they're just really able to take people who are in harm's way out of harm's way at a very efficient clip. So we've had quite a bit of success. Cost share will a determination will be made that, hey, what kind of 75% or 90% will NRCS provide, and that will be either of the market value of the land at the time of sale, or sometimes it makes sense to bring the clock back and what was this property actually worth prior to that most recent disaster. And that's something that the sponsor and NRCS work out together and kind of come up with a cohesive plan for a particular area. Like I said, NRCS will provide the cost share for the appraisals and all of the acquisition type activities. Also cost share on the lot clearing and the conservation practices that are installed to restore the natural environment. And then also there's the Universal Act, which is the Universal Relocation Act. I'm butchering that, but anyway, we do follow that. Hey, if there were tenants that were involuntarily displaced, there are benefits that are available to them to help them find new residents, deal with their relocation, pay for their moving, and some limited replacement costs. So we've got some cost share as well available for those people who are involuntarily moved. And so in conclusion, again, the sponsor requests the assistance, we do the damage survey report, and we get into the formal agreement and we get this stuff done. Potential EWP projects we've done a lot of times. If I'm trying to just think about numbers, we do a lot of neighborhoods. Like I said, buyouts range from we have 1 house projects, we have 2 house projects. I've seen 4 house projects, and we've been up to 40 house projects, and we've been up to 100 house projects in some really flood prone area and some really flooding areas. So, if it makes sense to move, no structural solution is going to, prevent some of this stuff. So sometimes a buyout is just the more economically feasible alternative. So same thing, just properties that are just going to be in the way, unfortunately, for repetitive floods. And giant structural solutions just will be too much of a O&M and cost issue. Then, think in the back of your minds, buyouts are available, especially EWP buyouts. So these links will be provided, but EWP resources, we got a 30-minute overview. That's just kind of a lot of what I just reiterated, but it'll be much cleaner and more professional because Ray actually voiced it. And then we have our EWP webpage, and then we have our EWP state program managers, right? And so this is going to be the list. Normally, the best point of contact, the person most informed in each state administrative unit of NRCS is the EWP program manager, and they'll be kind of the best bet for kind of an initial contact. So any other further questions as we transition to PL 566?
So John, move back 1 slide and I'll make there are more questions. Now, everybody get your iPhone or Samsung out and your phone and snap a picture of that, because I know you're going to want to go back to that and find those. So let's give a 3, 2, 1. I can hear the clicking going on, John, of the very important information. You always know that you hit the right slide, John, when people grab their cameras and start, their phones and start taking a picture. All right, now let's go to the question slide, and we've got some great questions here. Let's start out with the difference and maybe the coordination between the EWP buyout funding things that you just spoke about, separate from the FEMA buyout funding. Is there a correlation there? Is this funding separate from the FEMA buyout? Let's just start with that.
Yeah, definitely. It's 2 different programs with 2 different authorities, with 2 different funding pots, with 2 different criteria, with 2 different parameters, with 2 different personnel groups, with 2, so they are, in fact, while the end result can look the same, how we got there a lot of times is quite different. So what our staff, what the NRCS staff has been doing, that is similar to the way that, hey, when there's a major disaster and FEMA's public assistance and NRCS EWP have to kind of figure out how to both provide project sponsors and communities the best path forward. Hey, this program is not able to help you, but this one is, or this program is best suited to help you. We actually we can talk to FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, and which I think is one of the programs that might result in buyouts. And at the same time, again, still talk with them that, hey, oh, okay, you've offered hazard mitigation assistance to this particular neighborhood. Okay, that will be addressed with FEMA, and that will not be an EWP project because the resources have been addressed. Or we can work with them to be like, hey, yes, your FEMA designated area is this particular neighborhood, but because of EWP's flexibilities, we can go and pick up this street or this different area. So yeah, we'll work with FEMA and the sponsors and kind of have a round robin and bring everyone to the table so that we can find the best program to help the most people most effectively utilizing those two programs.
I think that answers a couple of questions. One individual wanted to know, do towns and, sponsors go both ways? Do they put a application in both ways? And then where does it come together or where does it separate? And I think you got that pretty well, John. There's some coordination that goes on there and the likelihood of someone getting monies from both would be.
No, that can't, to be honest with you, that can't really happen because the property can't be bought twice. Because if NRCS bought the property and FEMA goes down to the courthouse to try to buy it, or goes to closing and they try to buy it and just be like, no, like, what do you can't buy it from this person. So duplication of benefits is an important aspect. It is part of our review process, and we will catch things like that earlier in the process. But yeah, ultimately, like I said, we'll hopefully work. We have been working that out with FEMA on the front end, sharing property lists to either. So basically, to be honest, we probably work with FEMA we need to concentrate on working at different areas or at different times, right? So there needs to be typically the separation between the programs will either be, like I said, an area separation, or it'll be a time difference. Hey, FEMA came through here 3 years ago. We still got flooded out again. We still have some more opportunity for some buyouts. Then you can approach NRCS for EWP assistance.
Okay. So let's talk about eligibility, and then I want to talk with you a little bit about funding limits. So let's go to eligibility first. Limited resource area definition nowadays, and the context of a sponsor being able to claim that eligibility to get that 90% NRCS 10% sponsor. Talk with us a little bit about that. How does that work?
So I actually need to update that. I just got an email yesterday that says our LRA list is updated. So LRAs are listed at the county level. And at the county level, NRCS does an annual review of income data, unemployment data, and housing cost data. And then there's a formula that we use using those three parameters at the county level to make the case or to make the criteria that this is an LRA or not. And we will then post that onto our webpage, and we'll just have a county list for everyone and be like, pick your state, and you can see your state, and you can see the LRAs that are in the LRA counties that are in each state. So yeah, it's based on economic criteria, and it's more or less pre-populated and determined via NRCS criteria.
Okay, good. Still stick with eligibility for just a bit. You mentioned the properties in the way of repetitive floods. Does this mean the property must be a repetitive loss property as defined by FEMA?
No.
Okay.
No, we just need a natural occurrence. And in this case, our natural occurrence, think flood, fire, storms, hurricanes, typhoons. So any kind of natural occurrence that or another term, a natural disaster, any kind of natural disaster that would flood an area would potentially put the actual area into EWP eligibility consideration.
Okay. And the easiest question ever, John. One of our participants wanted us to put back the slides on the resources. So if you could do that, that'd be great. That'll be the easiest one we deal with, right? All right. So let's talk about dollars again. What pool of funding is the Emergency Watershed Program dollars come from? Another easy one.
Yeah. So traditionally, and as far as back as I can see, EWP is supplementally funded through Congress and approved by the president. So
Mhm.
a lot of times we've gotten EWP program has gotten funds through a continuing resolution. It's been tagged on to one of those. It's been tagged on EWP funding will be supplementally funded via a disaster supplement. One of those ones that just came through a little bit ago. So it really just depends. It's just, yeah, we are dependent on congressional action to provide additional funds for the EWP program. And then typically those funds are for the EWP program. And then we just go through our program regulations to disperse those particular funds.
Thanks, John. Sticking with the money now again. Are there funding limits annually for home buyouts?
No, there's not limits. No, that it would just be the project still has to go through our criteria of some semblance of a benefit cost analysis and environment and economically defensibility. So there aren't necessarily limits, but it's just like any practice. How much does this cost? And if it does cost this much, does it make sense to pursue this particular project?
Okay.
So yeah, there's not any hard numbers on the top.
And how about dollar amount caps? Do you have caps on certain things on the
No,
buyouts?
no, it just gets harder and harder to as things get more and more expensive, it gets harder and harder to justify. And so we do have projects that sometimes just be like, hey, even a buyout doesn't make sense here. And so yeah, it's just going through it. It's my answer for everything for a lot of people. It's like it just has to go through the process, and then we just have to evaluate it against our criteria.
Yeah. And back to EWP and the FEMA program, is there uh, is one faster than the other? The individual is saying they've been waiting for more than a year for a decision for multiple homes. So is one faster than the other?
I don't know the speed of their programs. I know NRCS is getting better.
Yeah,
We have had some really quick, surprisingly, in less than a year, from disaster to buyout happen.
yeah,
So uh, we're able to move quick. Sometimes, unfortunately, things get caught up and get slowed down, but we're moving as fast as we can,
yeah.
and I would think FEMA would be doing the same. It's too many factors to be able to nail that down.
I mean, about the one factor that you know about, there's a 60-day window to make sure things are gathered together and put together.
Yeah.
But after that, you said months. It could be months, and depending on the complexity, right, of the project and the activity.
Yeah, because it all just goes. So once the state conservationist has the funds in an allocated pot, and they now they can go to the sponsor and go into an agreement. Sometimes they want to do, depending on the state, depending on everything. Sometimes they want to do the actual design first. They want to work out some things and then go into the agreement so that the agreement goes faster. Sometimes no, they turn around and go into an agreement. They say, hey, we're ready to go into agreement today, but the sponsor will will be able to sign it right away. Or sometimes they have rules that, hey, it's got to go through before a certain board and a certain committee, and that committee doesn't meet until 2 months from now. So it's so regionally dependent that flexible that it can go any direction. But like I said, we do have procedures to move super fast when needed, and everyone's at the table and ready to go. But like I said, a lot of times it can take a couple of months.
Continue that close contact with the state conservationist and his or her staff, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. How about a livestock operation? like a confined swine production, can it be bought out? And if so, can the land still be farmed or used for, uh,
Mm,
agriculture?
So no,
Okay.
the yes and well. First part, there isn't a like I said, there's no land use restriction
Hmm.
when it comes to what properties may or may not be bought out. However, there is a number of criteria that would trip that up. Um, so it's just something that we need to work through on a case by case basis.
Okay.
And then the continue to farm. No, you wouldn't sell your a landowner would not sell their property to the county, and I'm just using county as an example, sell the property to the county, and then the county, we're requiring that they record a deed restriction that keeps that as open space
Hmm.
and in its natural in a natural state. So yeah, continued operation wouldn't be the program. By EWP buyouts wouldn't be the program for that. Not to say USDA doesn't have other programs that might be able, other easement programs that might be able to work something out for that for continued operation. It's just EWP wouldn't be the program.
Okay. John, I've got about three more questions here. Are you still game? All
Yeah.
right, here we go. How about LRAs? LRAs, will they continue to exist? LRAs.
Yeah, their LRAs are established in agency regulation, and so they are still in agency regulation today.
So, and on the railroad bridges, that was the issue downstream, accumulation of debris and structure. And this individual is asking a question, will EWP help clear debris downstream from a watershed that keeps causing problems by washing debris on down into a structure?
Yeah, debris removal is if that debris is sufficient to impair the watershed. Hey, this debris is going to cause
Mhm.
problems, and we can document that to be like, yes, it's all going to catch on this choke point down here.
Yeah.
Yes, EWP provides assistance for debris removal quite commonly in those cases.
So, and kind of tying a loop around it, you had mentioned one time potentially other programs if EWP doesn't cover it. And oh my gosh, that list must be huge. But some of them that kind of come to mind, if there's, something, EWP doesn't cover it, where would you send the sponsor then?
First, I'm sending them to Sonia and Watershed Operations.
Right.
is is a lot of times right because as Sonia alluded to, EWP is wholly focused on erosion and flooding prevention and protection, whereas next one we would talk about would be PL 566 and Watershed Operations because there are more um, project purposes that can be done with that.
Sure.
And then, but it's really working with the local NRCS state unit
Uh-huh.
and the state conservationists and their staff because they know the programs, right? They run the programs that they run the easement programs for their state. They run the RCPP and other kinds of programs that are active in that area. So really working with your local staff and saying, hey, listen, even if EWP wasn't a fit, they'll be able to explore other options with a particular community or area.
John, thanks so much. Get that drink of water, monitor the questions and answers. There may be some that you can answer, directly to the individual if you want to. Let's move to Sonia, and by doing that, we'll need to stop your share and start Sonia's. See how it works.
Thank you guys.
Good job, John. So I don't, we practiced this. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Sorry, just a little bit of a delay there. Okay. Can you see everything okay?
Still not coming through yet.
I did get a thing just a second ago that told me that I had a bad internet connection. So
Oh goodness.
hopefully
Okay.
Hopefully that is not gonna
There, you're
impede.
coming through with yep, your program is coming up.
Okay.
Thanks again, John, for answering those questions. There may be some holdovers that we'll capture after Sonia's presentation. Sonia?
All right, thanks. Sorry about that. Ray tried to get us to practice that and we still messed it up. So, as John said, my name is Sonia Keith, and I am going to talk just a little bit about the Watershed Prevention Operations Program. That's a mouthful, so you'll hear me say Watershed Ops or Operations quite a bit throughout this program. We're focusing obviously on flooding today. So we wanted to just take an opportunity to show you another watershed program that's within the NRCS kind of watershed branch that can deal with flooding. But as was previously mentioned, Watershed Ops is really a broad program. We can do a whole lot of different things. So most of what I'm going to talk about is related to flooding. I'll touch a little bit on different purposes that we can also do. Some of the big key differences between watershed operations and the Emergency Watershed Protection Program is for watershed operations, we're looking at an entire watershed area, and we're trying to address problems holistically in that watershed area long term. It is not related to a natural disaster or a flooding event. It's just you can have flooding in the area, but you don't have to tie it directly to a specific event or anything like that. So that's a key difference. There's also a lot of similarities between the programs. You'll hear me talk about sponsors. It's kind of the same type of people that have to sponsor these projects. The Watershed Operations Program is also it's more intensive. I guess that's the word I'll say. It's a longer process. It takes a longer time to get to that implementation piece. But we are looking at getting something in place to address issues for 50 to 100 years or longer. So I just kind of wanted to preface that at the beginning. So basically, very similar to emergency watershed protection, watershed operations. It's an NRCS watershed program as the federal government, and we are working with states or sponsors. Our enabling legislation, like I mentioned, is very broad, but basically we can do anything if it is addressing a resource concern related to erosion, flooding, sediment, or improving the utilization of land. So if you think about that, land or water, that's pretty broad. We're going to be working one-on-one with these local sponsors. These are locally led projects. The sponsor comes to NRCS at that local or state level and says, we have an issue in our watershed. Can you help us? That's how that process gets started. And also similar to emergency watershed protection, NRCS will be providing that technical assistance and that financial assistance to that sponsor. So watershed operations, we've been around for a really, really long time. We started doing watershed ops work in the 40s and 50s. We had some pilot projects back then. And for years, I would say through the 80s and 90s, what we primarily did was flood prevention projects like we were talking about today. And we built a lot of dams. We built almost 12,000 dams across the United States. We're kind of considered the small watershed protection program. So our dams tend to be kind of smaller, kind of tucked away. We have some caveats, some limits on the watershed size that we can do that I'll talk about in just a second. But we've done over 2,100 projects in about 50 states and territories. And so we've been doing this stuff for a long time. However, what we didn't get funded for a little bit in the early 2000s. And then we started receiving funding again in the program in about 2017. And we realized that we had been very focused historically on dam and that there was a lot of other things that we could be doing. So the watershed operations program today looks a lot different than it did if you were familiar with it in the 70s or 80s. So again, our enabling legislation is Public Law 83566. And I talked about this just a second ago, but just reiterating that this is a very broad program. You can do a lot of things. So what we tried to do was define some authorized purposes that you can do. And that's one of the different things about watershed operations is that you can do anything within these purposes as long as it meets the statutory requirements, and you can mix and match them. So flood prevention is still probably one of the most popular purposes that we do. There's a lot of flooding issues across the country. We have a lot of flood prevention projects that are ongoing, but we can also do things like ag water management. We're doing a whole lot of irrigation type projects. It's something that we didn't historically do very much of in the 80s and 90s. We can do watershed protection projects where we're dealing with water quality issues. It looks very much like putting conservation practice standards in a very targeted watershed area. We can do, usually I call these like companion purposes, but if you're doing like a flood prevention project and you end up building a dam, you can wrap in some public recreation, public fish and wildlife. We have municipal industrial water supplies projects that we can do. And then we have water quality management that's related to really just a watershed dam and just monitoring the flow that comes in and out for water quality of the stream downstream, down from the dam. So that's kind of our purposes. Each of our purposes has a different cost share component. So you can, again, mix and match purposes in a project. If you are a project sponsor, you can come to NRCS and say, we have this watershed area. There's some flooding going on. We have some water quality issues. We think we need to implement some conservation practice standards, and we have a significant irrigation project problem in this area. And you can kind of mix and match all those. They all have different cost share rates. We cannot compete with another or pay more than another program, another federal program. So I have the top one circled because we are, again, focusing on flood prevention. So that's another difference between watershed operations and emergency watershed protection that John just talked about. We pay under watershed ops, we pay 100% of that technical assistance. So that's that planning piece, the design piece, and 100% of the construction or the implementation piece. We can't, we also, under watershed ops, we cannot do anything with real property rights. So we can't get land rights. We can't do any permitting costs, that sort of thing. So that's all the sponsored cost. The other purposes you can see, most of those end up being about 75% federal to 25% if you're doing like watershed protection. Again, we can't compete with other programs. So that's similar to like what our environmental quality incentive program pays. So, we could work through all of those, if we were like stacking purposes. But watershed for flood prevention is 100%. So just as the name implies, if you are in an area and you're interested in pursuing some kind of flood damage reduction measures, we're just going to be going in and we're going to be looking at what we can do to address that situation, again, on a watershed scale. So we're going to look at different things like dams and levees and flood proofing. So elevating structures up out of the floodplain. I think John was kind of chuckling a little bit because he was saying big, massive structural projects. That's what a lot of our operations, flood prevention projects do tend to be that. They're the bigger, more structural kind of projects. And I'll go through a couple of examples of that. But we also look at non-structural things too. So we would consider flood proofing a non-structural fix to a flooding issue. And that's where you're just going to be elevating stuff out of the floodplain. We go through a planning process. I'll talk about that in a little bit. That's intensive and it takes a lot of time. But we're looking to make sure that whatever we're doing to address the problem, it goes through the appropriate analysis in that planning process. And so I always tell people for watershed operations, you really need to come in thinking about, here's my problem, how can I fix it? Not come in saying, I want a dam in my community so we can go fishing and help with flooding, right? We have to, as our statute makes us go through all the alternatives to figure out the best solution for the best benefit with the least cost. So it's not always what people have a preconceived notion about. So I'm just going to go real briefly over a couple of existing flood prevention projects that we just recently had authorized plans for. I'll talk a little bit about what that means, what an authorized plan is in just a second, but just to give you an idea of projects that are ongoing right now, that we have actually looked at the analysis and we came up with the fix to address it. So this one is in Mississippi, and talking about big structural measures. This authorized plan, the fix for flooding in this area in Mississippi, was to build 48 miles of levee and a bunch of drainage structures associated with that levee to kind of help manage water when the levees are being used. So that is one that was authorized just recently by the chief of NRCS. And our projects, again, are really long term. We're going to be trying to make sure these are in place and operational for at least 100 years if the levees get built. And it's a local investment to this area, but they also can be rather expensive. I think the estimated cost on this particular one is about $180 million. So they are big structural projects. Another one that we just recently authorized is in Nebraska. Again, I just picked flood prevention ones because we're talking about flood prone communities here. But this particular one, they are going to do a couple of dry dams, right? They're only going to be operational when they get that water flow, and we have some diversion channels associated with that. So that's the Upper Mud Creek Watershed in Nebraska. I've mentioned a couple of times statutory requirements. This is stuff that's in that public law that we have to make sure all of our projects adhere to. And you've heard John talk a lot about public sponsorship, and we have that same piece for the Watershed Ops program. I think my next slide will be talking a little bit more about what that is, but it's very, very similar to emergency watershed protection sponsor requirements. For flood prevention projects, you may have heard me mention a few minutes ago that we tended to be considered the small watershed program. So if we're doing a flood prevention project in an area, that watershed cannot exceed 250,000 acres. And then we also have some structural size capacities. So if you're building a dam or you're building a levee, we have some volume and capacity requirements. Everything that we build, we have to go through that planning process, and we have to make sure that the benefits exceed the cost. And we do have to show in that planning process that at least 20% of the benefits of our watershed ops project is going to be ag or rural related. That's in the statute. So we have to be able to show that through our economic analysis. And for watershed operations, we are required by statute to have an authorized watershed plan that is signed by the chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that's a big key difference between operations and EWP as well. So our planning process is intensive. I keep using that word, but we have to go through all the different options, viable options. We have to look at the economics. We have to look at the mitigation requirements, any kind of impact. And we have to have that environmental document that is associated with it. So emergency watershed protection, John mentioned that they have a national programmatic environmental impact statement that they pull from. There's some very specific parameters in that. As long as you're in those parameters, you're kind of good to go. So you can kind of, I'm not going to say skip, but you've met those requirements. So you don't have to go through that intensive process. Our projects, I just showed you that one in Mississippi, 48 miles of levee. They have to do their own environmental impact statement for that specific project. We can't do a national NEPA thing for most watershed operations projects because they're too, impactful. They have a lot of different things that they can impact in that area. So we do not have that national programmatic NEPA documentation. So all of our projects, for the most part, they have to have an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement that goes with what they're doing. And that's a big difference between the programs. So this is very similar. Our sponsors, they have to be able to provide land rights. They have to be able to do eminent domain You know, if again, going back to the Mississippi example, if we're doing 48 miles of channel work and there's two landowners right in the middle, or not channel work, levees, there's two landowners right in the middle that do not want to, give up land for that, then the entire project is dead, right? You don't want levees with holes in them. So we need a sponsor who has that capability of doing eminent domain if they choose to do it. We don't make a sponsor do that, but we need to say if this is important enough for you and your community, there has to be something that you can pull from if you need to. It has to be a tool in the toolbox to use. Permits and licenses, that's something that the sponsor has to handle. And the financial responsibilities. So again, there is a significant operation and maintenance component to a lot of our projects. If we're building dams and we need them to be operated and maintained in a certain manner to protect that federal taxpayer investment for 50 to 100 years, then that's something that the sponsors have to be able to do. So a lot of our sponsors need to either have the authority to levy taxes or have some sort of way to show that they can operate and maintain often very significant structural practices for a significant amount of time. So it's the same type of people that we're usually working with watershed operations. We're working with counties, cities. We do a lot of work with soil and water conservation districts, just the entities that have these capabilities. Also similar to emergency watershed protection, you can have a couple of sponsors who can kind of do the different things, or you can have one major sponsor who has maybe some side agreements with other entities to help with pieces. So process and timelines. What we do for operations is we generally fund in phases. The very first thing that we try to do is what we call a preliminary investigation findings report. This is really big picture. It's just to make sure that it makes sense to go in and start this multi-year, often multi-million-dollar process. Should we be spending that time and money there? Does this watershed meet these very key statutory requirements? So we do that up front. Usually I put on here 12 months to complete. We usually do those in 3 to 6 months. And it's just, should we move forward to planning? Because the planning thing, as I've mentioned several times, can take a long time and it can be intensive. So if that findings report is yes, this looks great, that's what gets you into the planning phase. The sponsor can request money for the planning phase. We'll do that watershed plan and that environmental document. At the end of that planning phase, you have your fix for your problem in your watershed. And then you also have an idea of cost and time. So how much it's going to cost, any kind of estimated operation and maintenance cost, any kind of estimated cost share. If that's, you have a purpose that has a cost share component, that's all done in that planning phase. At the end of it, you're signing a watershed agreement that kind of outlines those things. Then you go into design and then you go into construction. Now we can have watershed operation projects that's just doing conservation practice standards in a watershed. That design is going to be pretty quick and easy. Implementation is going to be pretty quick construction. If you're building 50 miles of levee, you can imagine that design is going to take longer and that construction is going to take longer. But if you add up, I have timelines on here, 18 months for the planning phase, 2 months for 2 years for design, 2 to 5 years for construction. It's very dependent on the project. But if you add everything up, you can see it's like a 7 to 10 year timeline. So it's a significant amount of time. It's a significant investment for NRCS, but also locally. And those timelines are if everything goes great. And I can tell you that a lot of times they don't, right? These tend to be very big projects in a very public setting. Sometimes there's a lot of public interest. Sometimes there's a lot of environmental interest, and the timelines can get really drawn out on these sometimes. So how do you get started? I mean, really to get started on this path is very simple. It's just a letter. It's a letter from a sponsor who meets those sponsoring requirements to you you contact your state program manager. Every state has a program manager. You submit that letter of request, and then we're going to put you in for that preliminary PIFR is that preliminary findings report. And then we're going to step through that process, and it kind of feeds each phase feeds the next one. But it all starts just with that letter. And then every time we're going to go to the next phase, we're going to be working closely with the sponsors to say, okay, here's what we're going to be requesting for this next piece. And so just key takeaways for watershed operations, this is locally led. It's a collaborative approach. NRCS is involved throughout the whole process. We're going to be working very closely with the sponsors, the local community. There's a whole public participation piece of this that we kind of work with you through the entire process. The most successful watershed operations projects are the ones that have really involved local sponsors and project champions, because like I've mentioned, that timeline is intensive. If you're dealing with a county or you're dealing with a city, there's going to be probably multiple elections that are happening. You really have to have people who understand why it matters to be going through this process. And as I mentioned, you can do a whole lot of different things with watershed operations. You can take that flood piece and you can add other things to it. So just some information similar to what John showed. We have our national website that has some information. There's a fact sheet, a little one-page front back fact sheet that's pretty good. It's kind of sponsor oriented, so can kind of give people a good quick overview of if this might be something they want to pursue. And then always, we always try to tell people to start at your local NRCS field office or your state NRCS field office. That's where those state watershed program managers are. And they can also help kind of navigate you through the different programs. I think that's it.
Thanks, Sonia. Listen, let's put that last one before. Yeah. Now I hear the iPhones and the cell phones all snapping pictures of that one. So that's good because that will be on your phone, right? And you can draw a reference to it. So let's take on a few questions here. Would you please provide some examples of projects covered under the municipal and industrial water supply for the watershed and flood prevention operations program, if there are any?
So we have a few. Now, we don't have a whole lot of those across the nation. We only pay, our cost share is not as great on that. We only pay half of the construction. But we do have some where we're doing a flood prevention project, and we have a watershed dam, and then the local city will add on a drinking water component to it. So we will build that into like the design of that dam. We'll put extra water storage in there for that. We also have some where they're pulling from the downstream side of the watershed structure to take water to like plants. There's one not far from me where they use the water in an aluminum plant for their industrial kind of work. So that's a couple of examples. They tend to mostly always be tied to building a watershed dam.
Okay, excellent. So for the watershed and flood prevention operations program, are area development districts eligible? Area development districts.
So if they meet those sponsor requirements, and I think it just depends on how they're set up in each state. So if an area development district can do lane rights, can they sign up to do operation and maintenance for 50 to 100 years? Do they have the capability of, doing eminent domain if they need to?
Right.
That's the questions that's the checklist you always have to go through for a sponsor. And again, you can have multiple sponsors. So if you're an area development district that might be able to do a couple of the pieces, but then you might co-sponsor with like a city or a county, that could be an option as well.
So sticking with those eligibility things, if you added extra water into a reservoir for drinking water, does that affect the percentages that would be covered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service?
Yes, so so drinking water would be municipal water,
Hmm.
and that purpose has a different cost share rate,
Yeah, yeah,
if
okay.
if that's what they're meaning. So we would pay, and when you're designing something like that, you're going to have a very defined amount of water that's going to be there just for the flood prevention piece and that dam height for that. And then you're going to know the additional water that's going to be needed for the municipal piece. And so that would be cost shared at a whole different rate. And it's like, I think it's 50% of the construction cost is what we pay for. So
Hmm.
50% on the sponsor. And then municipal industrial water, we don't do the technical piece. We don't do the engineering piece on that. So that's a 100% sponsor cost
Hmm.
for that.
Excellent.
But
Excellent.
you do that, it does change
It
the
does
cost.
change the
Yes.
formula. So
Mhm.
about success rates of dam projects in the West um, for the authorized purpose of agriculture water management. Can you speak to that? Maybe an example or two, Sonia? Is there a fairly good success rate? By the time you go through each of the steps that you have identified, right? Uh,
Mhm.
the good ones are sorted out from the bad ones. So I bet the success rate is extremely high, or it gets washed out somewhere in the application process or planning process.
Yeah, I think so. For ag water management out west,
Hmm.
I don't, I can think of a couple that might have really small because it said dams. Did you say
Yes.
dam?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Most, Predominantly, most of the ag water management projects that we're doing right now are irrigation related. And if there's a dam component, it's not a flood. That doesn't tend to be a flood prevention dam. It's maybe just a holding area
Hmm.
for water whenever the water reserves get low. So we do have a couple of those where they pull from like a retention basin kind of to the side. Most of what we're doing in the west for that is irrigation systems
Yeah.
or taking open channel and canals and
Uh-huh.
piping them,
Uh-huh.
making them more efficient.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing that we're doing with ag water management right
And in the West or anywhere, I suppose, huh?
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a question here in the Q&A box. It's just kind of a fun one. Uh, Looking at the prospects of modifying several existing farm ponds in a watershed, they weren't built with PL 566 funding, to increase storage and add cap capabilities to lower the water level in advance of a predicted flood event. So, if I'm reading this right, it would be um, they're asking the question: could that be done under a PL 566? Kind of taking these ponds that were developed, along the way as some kind of flood prevention reservoirs, right? Um,
Yeah. Like a
yeah,
lot of little dams instead of some big dams, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
Right, right, right.
So that is something that can be looked at if again, you're going into it thinking, I have a flooding problem. How can I fix it?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if that's something that seems legitimate in that area, you can look at it. It would be tricky because you're going to have a sponsor who can go into all these little different areas, right? If you're talking
Right.
about a bunch of landowners. So that sponsor is going to be able to have to be able to say, you know, from a strictly hydrology engineering standpoint, does it make sense to mess with these dams that are already here? It doesn't,
Uh-huh.
is it going to help address the problem? And then
Yes.
can we logically get to them? Will the landowners let us do what we need to do? And then in the end, similar to emergency watershed protection, whatever we do to those dams, they have to meet NRCS criteria. And
Okay.
I can just tell you as an engineer that can get kind of tricky
Yeah.
if it's a dam that's already out there and we don't have
Right.
any information on how it was built or designed. I
Right.
mean, it's happened. We've done work like that, but we have to ensure that it meets our standards. And this might be just our farm pond standard, right? It may not be like a big watershed dam. But that's
Hmm.
the kind of things that you would look at to see if it makes sense to move that forward as the alternative to address that issue.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow, that's a tricky one, isn't it? And
Mhm.
it would need to meet the NRCS standards and specifications, right? yeah,
Mhm.
at that point in time, not when it was built or what, but
Yes.
how is it constructed now? Wow. So what is a time frame from the flood event for submitting a request? Is there a time frame with the Public Law 566?
No, so for watershed operations, PO
Mhm.
566, there's no event.
Mm-hmm.
So you can come, we take requests all the time. There's no like triggering event.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be in an area that floods, just has a consistent flooding problem, and you can come to
Right.
NRCS at any time.
Right.
Emergency watershed protection is the one that's tied to an event.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Wow. I mean, you two, John, are NRCS National EWP Program Manager, and Sonia, our National Watershed Program Coordinator, Flood Prevention Operations Flood Program Coordinator. So I'm going to turn this next question over to our National Watershed Coalition leaders. And so let me cue you guys up, make sure that you're with us still. And I think the best would maybe be Jean. This question is going to be for you, Jean. I'm going to take the load off of John and Sonia for appropriate reasons. You know, you're following the EWP and the WFPO programs, Jean. What's it look like for funding available? And you really are so much in tune with this. What's going on? Can you tell us about the future availability of the programs? Gene, would you cover that one for us?
Well, I can speak as far as EWP locally here
Mhm.
in West Virginia. We've gotten a few of our EWP events have been smaller recently, and
Mhm.
we're working through that process.
Yeah.
Bigger picture on Sonia's projects, I can't speak to that, down the road at this point at this moment anyway.
Mhm. So tips, Gene. People are wanting to track this. People have active projects. People have this and that. And I just want to take the load off of John and Sonia. Give the group some tips, if you might, on what to do. First of all, they probably want to pay their dues to the National Watershed Coalition and follow your website information about what you're doing and that sort of thing. But are there other tips that kind of come to mind?
Well, as far as what I do, like the Watershed Coalition membership
Hmm.
idea, right? But as far as the EWP, stay consistent, have a good local sponsorship group, be organized for sure. I have a lot of experience working through EWP program here, and that benefits us.
Yeah.
On the bigger scale right now, I think it's the same. That's the advice. We get a lot of calls about that right now. And, my advice to the callers have always been be organized, um, um, uh, stay positive,
Hmm.
and keep moving forward because as a sponsorship, you do have responsibilities in this process. All of these or both of these programs that we talked about today, they both need one thing, a local sponsor. And so the local sponsor can do a lot of things as they
Hmm.
prepare for the project to come. I fielded a call last evening and we had a long conversation about just those things. So that's my advice right now until we see, until the funding starts coming again. Be prepared so when it comes, you can act on it. And so that would be my advice for sure.
Well, that's important advice. Tina, anything to add to what Gene said there? Tips of the trade regarding, we got kind of turbulent times going on now, budget-wise, program-wise, this and that and the other. Tina, some encouragement for the
I
folks.
think Jean hit it on the head. I mean,
Mhm.
communication, early communication, frequent communication, and organization.
Mhm.
Documentation, talking to the right people, having those relationships built going in.
Mhm. Very good. Well, we also have some future events, Gene. Should we cover those?
Yep, sure. Anyone on that will be participating with us in next week. We have our O&M workshop in Decatur, Texas, April 29th, 30th, May 1st. So if anybody's on the webinar that will be attending, we look forward to seeing you there. We'll have a full agenda for 3 days. We'll be doing some field visits, dissecting some dam O&M work, and talking about some legal issues as to access and maintaining these dams for the next foreseeable future. It's the title of our workshop is maintaining the investment. Dan started that years ago. We've just carried it through, just changing the years now. So we're really looking forward to that. And then follow us, as Tina said earlier, follow us on our webpage, Facebook page. As news comes up, really related to your question, Ray, we'll post anything we get there. We'll have upcoming webinars. We'll have hopefully some more sponsor spotlights. So that's the place to stay in tune as far as the Watershed Coalition activities for sure.
Certainly. And those know how active the coalition is and in making sure that key individuals within the administration and within other elected officials and whatnot are aware of what's going on. So we have such a great opportunity here. But before your closing remarks, Gene, I want to loop back to John. John, if you're still with us. This is a great time because about this time with just a few minutes left in the webinar, there's probably something you wanted to tell the group that you forgot to tell them. So now's the time to pop that into the webinar here. God, I mean, when you hang up, right, and 10 minutes later you're eating your whatever, your mid-afternoon, whatever, and you're saying, damn, I wish I would have said this. So here's your chance, John. What is that piece that we should have covered that we didn't cover, especially for EWP?
EWP is a great program. It's one of the most flexible programs in not only USDA, but maybe even all of federal government. So keep us in mind if, the purpose of this program is to help relieve threats from flooding and erosion. And that's what we try to do. And there's, like I said, there's been quite a number of successes with this program. So, talk to your state EWP program manager, and, just kick the ball off. Cause it's, the way to get into yes is you got to ask first. So,
Yeah.
we're here to get it done. So just let us know. That's all I got.
So
Thank you.
line up those sponsors, right? Make sure that you know what's going on. Put some information together. Man, if you're in a flood-prone community, it's going to flood, every other year or something. Geez, you get organized, right, John? Be ready.
Yeah, it's work though. It is still a commitment by the sponsor. It is still, but the results can be so rewarding, and we've seen so much great successes that just keep us in your thoughts if you need a structural or buyout solution. We're here to help.
An encouragement to the sponsors that are on the line. My gosh, if you already have had experience, make sure that you're planning for the next area. Also, make sure that you're tracking, the success of those treatments and that sort of thing too. NRCS could use your help regarding making sure that those treatments are working and that things are really up to snuff, you might say. Yeah. Sonia, same thing, right? So you're going to hang up the phone here in just a bit, or hang up our webinar, and wish that you would have said this to the people that are still remaining with us online. So give us your thoughts and any of those thoughts that you wish that you would have said but didn't.
Well, I guess I would just say, just take a look. I think a lot of people get maybe thrown off a little bit with watershed operations because it is so long, time intensive to get to that actual implementation piece.
Yeah.
And I would just say, we have a lot of examples of some very successful projects that have really changed entire communities. And if you're in an area that you think that any of those purposes that, maybe something that you could utilize, I would encourage you to reach out to the Watershed Coalition for some of those example projects and kind of see how it looks if you get to the end of it, right? If you get 7 to 10 years down the road and you can hear from community members We built all those watershed dams, those almost 12,000 watershed dams that we now have the rehabilitation project for. And they do such a good job that they don't even realize that they're there. So that's the kind of stuff that you can do with operations, right? You can protect communities so effectively, people do not even know they're being protected. So I would just encourage people to keep that in mind when they're thinking about ops.
And we have so many great sponsors across the nation too, right? And eh, to those points, now's the time to do the planning, to think about it, organize your sponsors, do the thought processes around preventing, some terrible flood things that go on. If you're in a flood-prone area, my goodness, you've been there for a while. You've been living in that community. Follow the guidelines that have been given to you by Sonia and John today as some outstanding information that's been provided. Now, for our closing comments, I'm going to turn this over to Jean and Tina in just a bit. But Jean, let's start with you. Some closing comments, please, and then we'll offer the same to Tina.
Yeah, well, I want to thank Sonia and John. There's a lot of information in a couple hours. I don't think they thought they would go as long as we did, but that was a lot of information for sure. And the thing I'll add, I talked a little about the sponsor. That's the world in which I came from, but also have that relationship with your NRCS personnel. Start at the local office, go all the way to the state office. You're the program managers in the state. So when something does come up, you know who to call. You already have that relationship and make them aware of your thoughts. So, I guess that would be one thing I would add as well. So I'll turn it over to Tina, but good job. Appreciate the information.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for all the information. Thanks to the audience for participating. And we look forward to seeing you on our Facebook page and at our website.
Thanks, Gene and Tina, and I'll add my thanks again to John and Sonia. Outstanding information. To remind you, the recording, go up to the National Watershed Coalition site. Make sure your membership dues are paid. I'm just going to say that for the fun of it. And then also, when you do that, you'll be looking for the webinar recording that will be posted there in a day or two. So, all right. Thanks so much, folks. And we'll conclude today's webinar. Thanks so much.